I don't take the view that the Cold War was the prevention of World War III. I take the view that the Cold War was World War III.
Welcome to Cold War Conversations.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
5, 2, 7, 1, 6, 6, 9, 8, 8, 3.
And I'm here to host this final program from the German Democratic Republic for you.
In Britain and the Bomb, Bill Nuttall draws upon insights from the laboratories, the military, popular culture and from politicians to make sense of a complex time and to challenge some of the widely held perceptions that Britain in the 1960s lost her technical ambition and ability. Now, if you're enjoying the podcast, please leave written reviews in Apple Podcasts, share us on social media, or leave a review wherever you write. By telling your friends, you can really help the podcast grow. It does cost money and time to produce the podcast, so I'm asking listeners to contribute $3 a month to help keep us on the air. Larger amounts are welcome too. Plus, you get that sought-after Cold War Conversations coaster as a monthly financial supporter of the podcast. You also bask in the warm glow of knowing that you're helping preserve Cold War history. Just go to coldwarconversations.com/donate. Thanks to our latest Patreons, including Chris Pearson, Dave Parry, John Rafferty, This Is Rami, John Helsinki, Scott G, Graham Horlock and Mr. Giles. So back to today's episode. The story pivots around a single day in April 1965. The recently established Labour government very publicly cancelled the much-vaunted TSR-2 nuclear strike bomber, causing dismay amongst aviation enthusiasts. We welcome Bill Nuttall to our Cold War conversation.
It's sometimes said don't judge a book by its cover, but in this case, together with Whittles, my publisher, we put some thought into the cover. Fundamentally, this is a book about nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, etc. You might take the view that, therefore, the book should be sort of black and orange and smoky with hints of fire. And, of course, there's some truth in that. But what you actually see is Charles Thompson's wonderful painting Before the Axe Fell of a TSR-2 climbing fast. And it's all shiny and silver and light blue. And why do I do that? I do that because I want to get the reader into the mindset of the late 1950s when that plane was specified. It's the new Elizabethan age. We've won the war. We have a kind of sense of optimism. And we want to reflect that in our technology, and that's why I do that. And then you look to the left on the cover of the book, and you see what you might think of as an RAF roundel, but it's not just serving that purpose. It's to evoke the mods, right? And the mods and the rockers on Brighton Beach in '64, because that's part of the zeitgeist, right? This is the rockers being Harley Davidson American influence, and the mods being the newly aspirational British working class and Italian designers. Who are we as a nation, right? It's all going on at the same time. Somebody gave me some good advice early on, and he said, look, Bill, a few people read books about aeroplanes and missiles, but most people read books about people, right? And I started to think, well, who are the people in this story? The test pilots like Roland Beaumont, or the military people who specified the plane like Douglas Lowe, And who are these people? And as I learned more about them, I realized that they'd all had an amazing war, basically. That someone who was 45 in 1965 had been 20 in 1940. So, and the core people at the heart of the story are mostly men, and that's a story in itself. But they were all shaped by the war in various ways. And so Dennis Healy, the politician who was the defense secretary, was a beachmaster at Anzio and an army major. They'd all had an amazing World War II experience. And I wanted to talk about that, because I think you can only really understand the mid-60s if you remember it's only 20 years or so after the war.
I think you're absolutely right there. I think the other thing that's interesting is you also give the social context of the time, because it's very easy to look at some of these periods with a modern lens, but you give quite a lot of detail about the social context.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things to say is that in this spirit about, books about people, the one thing to say is that, I take the view there were three great conflicts in the 20th century. And they all, have a human story to them. One is the First World War, with the Tommies on the Western Front, and that kind of mythological football match with the Germans at Christmas, and then you have World War II with Douglas Bader and his tin legs, and the Battle of Britain, and all of that. But you have similar personal human stories about the Cold War. So that's to reiterate the point about the people. But the people sit in a context, in a social, cultural context, and so one of the things there is that towards the end of the book, I talk about the deployment of the first Polaris Resolution class submarine in '68, which is only 1 year after the Summer of Love and Sergeant Pepper's, and as it set sail, as I recall, Jumping Jack Flash by the Rolling Stones was high in the charts, right? So this is not Pathé newsreel. This is not black and white grainy imagery. This is full Technicolor in the swinging 60s. So I wanted to place it in its historical context, partly because some of my readership will remember that period from their youth, right? So that's when we're talking about the mid to late 60s.
Yeah. And we sort of mentioned earlier this acronym TSR2.
Yes.
Can you just explain a little bit more about what that was and what its significance was during this period?
Well, yeah, let's start by unpacking the acronym. So the part that's clear is what the TSR stands for, which is Tactical Strike and Reconnaissance. The 2 is sometimes said to refer to Mach 2, the very high supersonic speed that it would be able to do at high altitude. So this was a plane that was specified in the mid-50s, and I tell that story, and was remarkably ahead of its time, I would say. I mean, personally, I take the view this would have been a challenging spec for the 1980s, and there it was being specified in the 50s, and that's partly probably why it's so well remembered. But things to particularly stress was that the T for tactical is a reference to includes a reference to nuclear weapons there. So the idea that this is an aircraft that can carry tactical nuclear weapons. And there was a kind of recurrent thread in the narrative that, would it be a part of a strategic deterrent weapon system? And it never officially had that status. But there were factions of the Air Force in particular who came back to that idea time and again. And that relates to something that's going on around this time, which is the start of the transition of the British nuclear deterrent from the Royal Air Force to the Royal Navy, right? And, as I said, it's only 20 odd years after the war. And of course, the war had been hugely important for the RAF, which had been founded only at the end of the First World War. And, the Few and the Battle of Britain and Bomber Command, there was a huge national affection for the Air Force. And they had emerged extremely important and had been carrying Britain's nuclear weapons under their giant Delta Wing V-bomber force. So the deterrent was at this time passing from the Air Force to the Navy. And the TSR-2 aircraft was the main aircraft program for the Air Force. And there's a whole story there in the background about why that was the case, and the role that the TSR-2 aircraft would be playing with the aircraft industry. But of course, the famous thing about the TSR-2 was that not long after Labour came into power, so in the spring of '65, the aircraft was very clearly and publicly cancelled by the Labour government.
And it was quite an advanced aircraft for its time as well, wasn't it?
Well, yes, and this takes us to something I think that is not sufficiently discussed about TSR-2. And I think I'm originally indebted to Guy Finch for this idea that he wrote a student thesis many years ago, which is the idea that TSR-2 wasn't just built for Europe. Yeah, we think today of the Cold War and Britain and the bomb, and we think so much about NATO and potential warfare in Europe or in the Arctic region. But in the 50s, going into the 60s, that wasn't the case. Britain was involved in other important treaties. It was involved in the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, SEATO, or in the Central Treaty Organization for the Middle East, CENTO. Now, these were very important treaties for Britain at that time, and TSR2 was important to meet the defence needs to underpin those treaties. So TSR2, its specification, allowed it to operate off improvised airfields and to be sort of self-supporting in the field for long periods of time. And it had these giant wheels on it that allowed it to again to take off from essentially jungle airstrips. And this is not really for Europe at all. This is for Southeast Asia. This is sort of flying out from Australia to fight a war in Southeast Asia. And by the end of the 60s, this was no longer a British objective or goal. But at the end of the 50s, it definitely had been. And meanwhile, in the European context, this attribute of flying really high and fast, well, that was increasingly not necessary. So through that lens, through the whole so-called East of Suez lens, where the same Labour government would go on to retreat from East of Suez. Through that lens, TSR2, if you're not East of Suez, you don't need TSR2 to some extent. And that's not a common part of the narrative.
So in the late 50s, the Defence Secretary, Duncan Sandy, writes a white paper where he talks of the future being pilotless, which obviously is a threat to the TSR2 program as well.
Yeah, and I think, arguably to the Air Force as a whole. So this pilotless idea that Duncan Sandy had come up with then, well, first of all, he probably came up with it much earlier. People, as it's talked about in the book, wonder, how early he took this view that, the future for the Air Force was going to be missiles, basically. I should stress he never had that view for the Navy. He did take the view there would be piloted aircraft for the Navy. But for the Air Force, yes, he seems to very clearly have taken the view that, pilots would no longer be needed. And, for a 1957 white paper, that was, I would suggest, manifestly wrong. In the 21st century, it becomes an interesting idea, but not in 1957. And the consequence was that there were very few government-led aircraft projects for the Air Force, and in fact, it got down to just one, the TSR-2. It wasn't, in fact, though, the only plane destined for the Air Force, because Hawker Siddeley, entirely off their own bat, as I understand it, were working on what became the Harrier jump jet. So that plane, was a British heritage and done for the Air Force, but not with government money initially. Whereas
the
TSR-2 was the government's piloted plane, and there'd only be one. And they used that reality for a very important part of the whole TSR-2 story, which was basically an act of industrial policy. And this is perhaps the clearest way in which TSR-2 was a success, actually. So coming out of World War II and that whole story of shadow factories, building planes designed by other people and dodging the bombs of the Luftwaffe, that shadow factory heritage had led to just a crazy number of aircraft companies and also a crazy number of aircraft engine companies for, what was, a modestly sized country. And it was just clear that this had to be rationalized. But the banging of heads together to force them to merge was not easy. And that was a condition of the TSR-2 contract. This very ambitious, clearly going to be well-resourced aircraft project required a consortium to be built. Government insisted upon that. And that gave rise to the British Aircraft Corporation, which after further mergers and changes is today's BAE Systems. And the heart of that process of amalgamation was the bringing together of Bristol, the aero engine company, but also very importantly Vickers and English Electric, two very important World War II aircraft companies with rather different heritage and strengths. And these entities were forced to merge. And that was, through the TSR-2 project and I would suggest has been a helpful thing for British aviation industry ever since. But of course, the aircraft itself was cancelled.
Yeah. And in 1960, Gary Powers is shot down over the Soviet Union in a U-2, and that changes sort of aircraft strategy to quite a significant extent.
Yes, so previously there's this whole notion of supersonic deep penetration into the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union, and Gary Powers was shot down at very high altitude in his U-2, and therefore Soviet surface-to-air missiles can bring you down when you're going at a very high altitude. As a consequence, many aircraft projects bit the dust. The North American Valkyrie and the British TSR-2 in some sense, because TSR-2 was very much to be a supersonic aircraft, and then once it was behind the Iron Curtain and getting closer to target, it could terrain follow. But when you're hugging the ground at a few hundred feet, you're going to be below the speed of sound. You're not going to be at supersonic speeds because of the thick air and the turbulence and things like that. So basically, this high altitude, high speed Mach 2 penetration attribute, that was kind of ended by the Gary Powers shooting down. It just wouldn't be safe to go in high and fast anymore. And that became so true for, it had consequences for the deterrent that was being carried by the V-bombers. So, the Vulcan bomber, which again, although not supersonic, had been a high altitude aircraft, was suddenly, forced low. And that literally put a lot of strain on these aircraft. So basically if you're going to come in, you're going to come in now low and fast, but you're not going to be flying supersonic. And that gives weight in that context to the alternate aircraft proposition, the Blackburn Buccaneer, that was frankly the Navy's plane. It couldn't go supersonic, but it could go fast and low. And as various people, including Lord Mountbatten, said, why not have those? Because they're cheaper. And in a European context, that makes sense. TSR-2 and its successor in British thinking, the F-111, would always have made sense east of Suez, but as I already mentioned, politically, that was ending.
Britain was also trying to develop some of its own missile systems during this period as well, because I think they recognised the problem with getting close to the Soviet Union, so they were developing sort of a standoff missile, which I think was the Blue Steel.
So that's right. So that's a weapon that was carried under the very large Vulcan bombers, the V bombers, and is a standoff weapon. And so the bomber doesn't have to fly over the target. It drops the weapon, and then the weapon flies very high speed to target as the bomber turns for home, or at least tries to turn for home. So yes, but Blue Steel was not the weapon for the TSR-2.
I understand that the UK are then keen on an American missile system, the Skybolt, but Kennedy cancels that in 1962.
Yes.
So Macmillan then goes in to negotiate an alternative and does quite a good deal, I believe.
Well, yeah, so December 62, the Americans, Kennedy administration, tell the British that they're going to cancel the Skybolt standoff weapon, so a much longer range version of the concept that the British had going with Blue Steel. And they're going to cancel it, and they said to the British, you can finish it, in our factories with your money. And this was a time when there wasn't the free exchange of currencies. Dollars were very precious for the British government. And the idea of taking on the open-ended risk of financing this entire American weapon system, Skybolt, that was a non-starter. There was no chance that the British were going to finish Skybolt just for our own needs. So clearly, Skybolt was off the table, which was the next phase planned for the strategic Air Force delivered nuclear deterrent. As I said earlier, the T in TSR-2 stands for tactical, but the more strategic deterrent was going to be Skybolt under the big Vulcan and the V bomber force. The Americans took that off the table, causing real concern. But by April 1963, the British had got the Polaris sales agreement, whereby we got the right to deploy the Polaris submarine-launched ballistic missile. Quite a remarkable increase in British capability. And that is the key part of the story by which the nuclear deterrent, passes in time from the Air Force to the Navy. But one of the aspects of that story is, and it actually surprised me how soon thereafter it appeared. By the mid-60s, the British began to realize that for us, there were worries around Polaris because our force was quite small that we were going to be getting, and it might not fit our defense needs. So from relatively early on, we started to worry about Polaris. And as I said earlier, we were cancelling TSR2. So all these things are going on at the same time. And it allows me to make a link to something I'd like to mention, which is that I said that there were three great conflicts in the 20th century. And I don't take the view that the Cold War was the prevention of World War III. I take the view that the Cold War was World War III. And by that, what was the Third World War? It was a technologically dominated chess game, basically. Thankfully, it was the war which killed by far the fewest people, but by no means a negligible number if you think about Vietnam and Korea and all the other conflicts. But it killed far fewer people than World War II and World War I. But it was more technological than either World War II and World War I. And this chess game is that you move the pieces by developing and deploying or giving up and decommissioning. These are acts in the chess game. And, by moving, the deterrent from the Air Force to the Navy or by cancelling the TSR2, these are some pretty bold moves on the chessboard.
Right. So at this point, though, TSR2 is still going ahead, and yes. Australia is seen as a strong export market for the aircraft, but the US are courting them with an alternative.
Yeah, so the alternative is the F-111 from General Dynamics, which is an interesting heritage as an idea itself. And broadly, the F-111 aircraft and the TSR-2 aircraft are similarly capable. They deliver that capability in somewhat different ways, and that's talked about in the book, but they're similar capability aircraft at around the same time. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the whole Australia dynamic is that let's take it back to sort of Britain and the victory in World War II and going into the 1950s. There are various ideas about Britain's role in the world after winning the war, and we know what did happen. What did happen was that we built a strong relationship with the United States, which became particularly strong in 1958 with the Mutual Defense Agreement. And we ended up very focused by the closing years of the 20th century on NATO and European security and the Arctic, right? But that wasn't the case, as I said earlier, in the 50s, right? With these other obligations and outlooks. So there was an idea that didn't last very long, and I think it wasn't a good idea, the so-called Fourth British Empire, that was a kind of partnership of the United Kingdom with essentially kind of southern dominions, thinking like Australia, New Zealand, etc. And this would form a kind of economic and defense community out of the ashes of the British Empire, in a sense, and allow us to look the Soviets and the Americans in the eye, if you see what I mean. And I don't think that was ever credible, but that idea had sort of been in the background and as a British idea that was rejected. And it would have involved us, for instance, giving the bomb to the Australians and things like that. We know what did happen, and I think at this point it's also to think about the Australian perspective on all this, because by the 60s, they are not seeing themselves as part of a Fourth British Empire concept. They're an independent country, on their way to fully achieving that, and with their own strategic needs and concerns, and as you say, being courted by the Americans. And one of the very clear bits of evidence on that is the Vietnam War. So, Australian troops fought in Vietnam, And British troops never did. Dennis Healey, the guy who cancelled the TSR-2, was endlessly pressured by the Americans to send British troops to Vietnam, but he absolutely refused. So Australia and Britain are making different choices, and Australia is being courted by the Americans, and a big example was in '63 they chose not to buy the British plane. They chose to buy the American plane, the F-111. And I do take the view that if Britain had sold it to Australia with that export order, the plane might have had a brighter future. I only say might have. It's not manifestly the case that it would. But yeah, the Australian rejection of the TSR-2 was very bad news for those in the Air Force and BAC who were planning that as being a major part of Britain's defence future.
Yeah. And the early 1960s, there was Conservative government in the UK, but in 1964, Harold Wilson comes in with a Labour government, and that's also the same year that the first of the TSR-2 fly. But there's a lot of concern flying around increasing cost and relevance.
Yeah, so there's a few things sort of embedded in what you just said. TSR-2 had what's called batch production. They, in fact, didn't make a prototype. The very first aircraft would have been actual aircraft in service. And that was arguably one of the TSR-2 mistakes, that actually they should have had prototypes. But to your more important point about Labour and TSR-2 and the cancellation, I think one of the things that I hold in mind is that the Labour Party, through its history, has had an interesting relationship with British nuclear decision-making, nuclear weapons decision-making. So, early on I said that Clement Attlee's 1946 government had made a decision to develop a nuclear weapon. We have these decisions being made by Labour in the 60s that involve the cancellation of the TSR-2. In the 40s, the Attlee government had made nuclear weapons decisions that were very important. But in the 60s, the Labour government's making nuclear weapons decisions that are very important, particularly around Polaris and its upgrade, this technology called chevaling, but also, later, outside the period of the book, in the late 1970s, Labour again sets the ground for the decisions that would be the Trident deployment. So this is the Jim Callaghan's late 1970s government is also making important decisions in support of Britain's nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. So, at the top level, the Labour Party-led governments are making decisions in favour of British nuclear weapons capability. But it's extremely controversial within the Labour Party, especially at certain times. So the party would have had prohibitions or conference resolutions against nuclear weapons. And this meant that the whole issue of nuclear defence planning was very sensitive for Labour politicians. But to say that, if someone were to say that Dennis Healey cancelled TSR-2 as an act of nuclear disarmament, that would be, very wide of the mark. No, he's making decisions in a very cost-constrained framework, which are broadly, or I would say strongly, in favour of maintaining Britain's nuclear weapons capability. And that is talked through in the book.
Yes, yeah, no, it is indeed, and I think that's the interesting, or one of the many interesting strands in here is that essentially, by the time Labour comes in 1964, the relevance of TSR-2 in national defence and also the increasing costs almost make it inevitable that the programme's going to be cancelled, wouldn't you say?
Well, here I'm indebted to Matthew Jones, the official historian of the deterrent, because I was conscious that various ideas had been circulating in government at exactly the same time, but he points very clearly to the fact that it all came down to the fact that in a situation where they didn't have enough money, they were faced with a choice. Would they continue with this capability for a great plane for the Air Force, which by then was the F-111 option, or would they persist with improving the Polaris-based weapon system in the submarines? and they didn't have enough money to do both. And Dennis Healy was very keen to keep the Air Force option alive, but when push came to shove, he chose the Cheveline submarine upgrade. So, so that's all going on in the 60s, and the idea that one finally was chosen over the other was something that I saw in the official history. So I don't look on TSR2 as having been this kind of melancholic failure of British policy. I said earlier that it left us with a very strong industrial strategy legacy, a good one. But also I do see the act of starting it and then cancelling it as moves in the chess game that I mentioned earlier. And the cancellation of TSR2 was quite a shrewd move. So what happened was that Dennis Healy managed to negotiate at zero cost in the end. He got the price down to zero. An option on the F-111 aircraft, and then he cancelled TSR2. So, he wasn't sure, I think, about, what the future would hold. And the question is is looming there in the book, that was he thinking already of getting out of east of Suez? But he has always denied that. But anyway, so the option of such a plane was hugely valuable, but it wasn't manifest that we really, really needed it. That's my view. And he managed to negotiate that option with the Americans at no cost and cancelled TSR2. And I think if we'd not had TSR2 as a credible alternative, he would never have got an option on F-111 at zero cost. It turned out a couple of years later, we cancelled the option. But we had the option for a crucial couple of years in the mid-60s. So that's one point that I think is important to understand. One of the things about nuclear deterrence is that the debate in Britain is very often about whether to have one or not, and not really what it's for in a more detailed sense. And there are many ways to deter a potential aggressor. And I think in this period of the high Cold War, the putative aggressor is the Soviet Union, right? And there are many ways in which you might threaten the Soviet Union with retaliatory harm, but one of them is the destruction of Moscow. And Moscow was essentially the best defended place on planet Earth, and it was clear that it was going to be even better defended with the deployment of a set of missiles. Not around the ring road of Moscow, but a long way from Moscow, all set up to defend Moscow. And these missiles went by the name of Galosh. And they were missiles designed to explode nuclear weapons in outer space, to intercept incoming offensive weaponry. And so the situation Britain found itself in was that we were going to have 4 ballistic missile submarines. And in fact, today we have 4 ballistic missile submarines. 4 is the standard number now. In the original scheme of Polaris, the Britain were going to have 5. The British were going to have 5. But to save money, the Labour government, before they knew about the things I'm now talking about, cut the plan down to 4, simply to save money. And with 4, the idea is that there's going to always be at least 1 on patrol. There might be 2, but there's definitely 1. And the capability was to fire 16 missiles from a single launch point, from a single submarine. And each missile had 3 warheads, which would fall as a triangle on the target. And if you're going to ring Moscow with ballistic missiles to defend Moscow, well, you only need 16 in principle to stop all 16 British incoming missiles. But the rumours were that by the 70s, they might have as many as 100. Which meant they'd have many spare if the British ever wanted to fire their weapons at that target. And because the British were setting themselves quite a high benchmark standard for what their deterrent, should be able to do, this so-called Moscow criterion, it wasn't at all clear that going into the future that the Polaris force would be able to do that. And that put a challenge down that the government and the technical people spent many years working on at enormous expense to beat this expected ring of missiles around Moscow.
And so I think you also cover in the book the sort of difference in aesthetics between TSR2 and Cheveline in so much that it's very difficult to, produce imagery around what the Cheveline program was about, whereas I think most people would say that the TSR2 is a very visually impressive aircraft.
Yeah, so I think one of the themes of the book is that here are two utterly British technological innovations. One is the TSR2 and one is Cheveline. The TSR2, with its famous cancellation, is this kind of part of a story, a rather melancholic story about Britain that gave up, Britain that can no longer make anything, a kind of post-industrial Britain, and a Britain with less ambition, associated with the cancellation of this, some would say beautiful plane, which I should say some of the technologies, go into Concorde, which is, similarly at the heart of the nation. You think about these times, but again, did not go well as a technology. So that whole thread leads us to, think about, who we are as a nation. Meanwhile, there's something we did develop and did deploy, Cheveline. It was utterly secret. And the first time anyone knew about it was when it was announced, and then shortly thereafter there was a Public Accounts Committee report in the early 1980s that pointed out just what enormous amounts of money had been spent on it, which I think led many to think that anything that cost that much must have been a waste of money. But I sort of suggest it was a very, very large scale and ambitious thing. But you can buy an airfix model today of the TSR2. There was a cutaway of the TSR2 in the Eagle comic. It was on, in the newspapers and widely talked about. And Cheveline was utterly invisible. And so I think, when Dennis Healey and the others in government were making these decisions around, our treaty obligations as NATO becomes more important, our industrial strategy, the notions of deterrence and all this, and for reconnaissance and all the attributes of these aircraft and things, what they weren't thinking about was the nation's sense of self or its national identity or, its optimism. No, they were making defense policy choices. But the funny thing is the choices they made had consequences around our national sense of self. And because, of course, they were very conscious of the decisions they were making in favor of Polaris upgrade and all the high-tech things that were going on with that. But, of course, that wasn't visible. So while you can have your airfix model hanging from the ceiling of TSR2, you don't find that with Cheveline.
No, indeed. And the book has some lovely color plates in there showing some of the imagery that the British Aircraft Corporation were using to describe some of these projects, as well as some great black and white images. So I highly recommend getting the book, and we are also doing a book giveaway. So we've been kindly given 3 copies of the book, and there will be details in the show notes as to how you can win this book. The book is Britain and the Bomb: Technology, Culture and the Cold War. And as Bill said, it's not a strictly what I would call a rivet counter book. It doesn't go into huge detail around the weaponry, if that's your bag. It's more around the culture and the context and the politics that went around the decision to move Britain's nuclear deterrent from an airborne deterrent to a submarine-based deterrent.
Thanks, Ian.
And we have further photos, videos and information on this episode in our show notes, which will show as a link in your podcast app. Don't forget, if you'd like to get one of those Cold War Conversations coasters, help keep us on the air, then head over to coldwarconversations.com/donate. And if you can't wait for the next episode, do visit our Facebook discussion group, where listeners just like you continue the Cold War conversation. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thank you very much for listening. It is really appreciated. Goodbye.